Well, welcome to another edition of My Life in Football, of course, sponsored by Square Media and Repos Retail Solutions. And really pleased to say joining me today is John Morton. And John, it's great to see you. And first things first, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm fine, David. Yeah, I'm in good rude health, as they say, for someone of my age.
What, 21?
Oh, I wish I was.
So, I mean, John, we always start off, with the same sort of questions, and we'll start off with that one with you again today. I mean, how did a young John first get involved in football? Was it through sort of refereeing? Was it through playing for your, schoolboy team? I mean, what was the first, your first sort of steps on the ladder to, with football?
Well, it was kicking around at the local park, basically, with friends. I played in the primary school side. I played for the district because I was a big kid, so I could whack the ball a distance. And I was an outfield player at that stage. But every waking hour was spent playing the game, basically. Didn't live very far from the Gillingham Football Club. So I used to go, I sort of walked around it and didn't go. And the first game I ever saw was 1955 with my two aunts who were very keen on sport. My dad wasn't interested at all. And they were badminton and tennis players. They took me to a game between Medway and Middlesbrough in the English Schools Trophy. 5th round it was at Priestfield, and Middlesbrough won it. And that was the first time I'd actually been into a ground and saw what it was like. And then basically after that, I just kept playing football. And as I say, I wasn't bad out in the field, but I was bigger than the other kids. So I played in the Derek Lewis Cup final, which was the big local primary schools final, which we lost to Balfour School. And then I went to the grammar school, past my 11 plus, just about, and I played rugby. So I played rugby. And again, because I was fairly big, I quite enjoyed that. But I still kept playing football with mates because all my mates went to the secondary modern school or the tech. And we got to the park. And eventually, I kept playing, and a mate of mine called Brian O'Sullivan, who takes a lot of credit, he tells me, for my subsequent career, he got me to play for a team called St Mary's. It was a little local, and it was run by a fellow who was about 17 or 18. He just got married, and at that stage, I was just started playing goal. So his wife decided to knit me a jumper as the goalkeeper, except she ran out of one colour green halfway through. So I had this two-tone jumper which I wore, and the first time I played in it, when it was really wet, a dive for a ball got up through a puddle, and the thing was down by my knees, etc. So that's when I started playing locally, and then one or two people saw me play, and I played for a civil service team. I played for the Boatman Call on a Sunday, and then Brian said to me one day, "Oh, we've got this game at Chatham Football Club against Gillingham Youth side. Do you want to come and play?" So I said, "Well, yeah, I'll come and play." So I went and played, and a fella called Ernie Morgan, who was then the manager at Chatham, saw me play, and I was about 16/17. And he took me. He obviously saw something in me which other people hadn't, and he took me to Chatham. So I started playing in the old Metropolitan League in about 1965. And that was a great league because it had all the third teams, the A teams in those days of Arsenal and West Ham and Tottenham and various people. So you ended up playing against some quite well-known people. I mean, I played against Brian Deere and Trevor Brooking and these sorts of people. And then I went and played at Gillingham. Gillingham took me. I dislocated a shoulder playing on the field, would you believe? And then I sort of, by the time I got back again, Gillingham had taken some interest in me. So I went and played in the youth side there. And a very good fella called Hughie Russell said to me, "You don't want to come here, son, because the manager's going to get sacked soon." The manager was a fella called Basil Hayward, who had played for Portsmouth in their championship winning side in the 50s. And he was right, because he did get sacked the following season. And I then went off to college. So that first part of my football career was very much local football. And then I have a sort of break for about 3 years when I go off to college and play for the college sides and played a bit of local football. which was down in Reading. And then just before I came back, Ernie got in touch with me again. And I then went and played at Dartford when I first started teaching.
But what was it like though? Was it such a? I wouldn't want this to sound the way it's possibly going to sound. Going to play for someone like Gillingham, a league side, was that a real big thing for you then, even back then?
Well, it was, you see, but it was slightly different because I can remember my boy era. Through the '60s, I went and watched Gillingham play, so I was very keen on watching the Gills play. And I was actually the other night when they put the floodlights up. They got the floodlights and they put markers all over the pitch and then direct the lights down on that. And we crept in the back of the stadium to see that. So I was a big keen. So to get the chance to play at Gillingham was amazing. So during the holidays, I've gone in to play in a practice game. I got called in, and I'm sort of seeing all these guys. And my hero was John Simpson, the goalkeeper. Anyway. We've come out onto the pitch because in those days you didn't have training pitches. They used to train on the main pitches all the time during the season. So anyway, Simo's come out and he's got a fag on, and he puts it down by the side of the pitch, jogs one lap, comes back, picks his fag up, and carries on smoking. So this was the sort of warm-up session, because those days you didn't warm up. You might do one or two stretches in the change room, then you'd sort of go out on the pitch. Anyway. I've gone in goal at one end, Simo's at the other. The manager, Basil Hayward, is playing centre forward, as he always did. And we had a couple of wingers they used to play. And what I didn't know, because I wasn't involved on a regular basis there, was that as soon as the manager managed to score a hat trick, then they could all clear off and go off to the pub or snooker or wherever they were going to go. So, like an idiot, I thought I was supposed to be there to stop a few shots and goals. And Hayward has a shot early on, and I go full length and save it, quite pleased with myself. And I get the biggest rocket of my life from the centre half, who then explains to me that the whole point is the quicker he manages to get his hat trick, the quicker they can all clear off down the snooker or the pub. So it wasn't quite the sort of organised soccer that you'd expect in those days. There was a fellow at Huey Russell, because they were going to offer me a year, because I was 17, I was doing A-levels at school then. And Huey Russell called me one day, and he'd been a player there in the 50s. And he basically said, look, don't go to college, do whatever, because as he said, this fella's going to go soon. And it's too precarious, which of course it was, because there was a young lad there who'd been an England Youth International who never got beyond those 2 years as an apprentice, which they were in those days, from 15 to 17. At 17, you either got a contract or you were out the door.
I could just imagine Arsene Wenger doing that, saying, look, literally, let me score a trick and we'll go down the pub.
That's right. Yeah, but I mean, so it was for a very naive sort of grammar school boy. This was quite unusual, but.
I mean, you was there for, as you said, for a bit, and then sort of went back, started back again about 3 years later. Did you say at Dartford? What was it like going into somewhere like Dartford? Because we now know it as being one of the big non-league clubs in the in the sort of Kent Essex area now.
Yeah, well, it was. I think I was probably the only. I was the only guy who hadn't had some experience of a pro club, had been at a pro club and been released or had a bit of a career. So there was a lad called Dougie Webb, who'd been at Reading, and his son Neil ended up as an England international, etc. So Dougie was there. Dougie had been that they'd all come out in those days. Even league players, they all came out and played, in the Southern League, because they didn't make any money from football itself. The minimum wage had only disappeared in about 1960. But even so, they weren't getting paid much. It was a fellow called Tony Nicholas. I always remember saying to a young lad who gave him some stick one day, and Tony had been at Chelsea initially, then at Brighton, and he said, look, son, it's better to have been a has-been than never was, which was always the thing that you got thrown at you, a bit like the sort of issue of how many caps have you got, who you played for previously. So I was amongst all these guys who had played, and they were a good bunch, and I just kept my mouth shut, because I learned, I just learned so much from playing with them. And the first season I went there, I got 2 very bad injuries. One I managed to break my jaw in 2 places at Trowbridge, where I came out to punch the ball and the centre forward headed me and he knocked himself out and was carried off. I carried on playing like an idiot that last 20 minutes and then went and taught for 3 or 4 days in school before I realised, because I'd had an x-ray in, what was it, Whittingham Hospital in North London, and this young sort of guy there had said, young doctor had said, oh, it's just very badly bruised. Well, about Thursday, I was in hysterics because I was in so much pain. So I went to the Eastman's Dental Clinic, Royal Free Hospital in London, because that's where I was working, I was teaching. And a guy x-rayed me and said, oh, you've got a double fracture. You know, it's not displaced, but you're all right because the consultant's in this afternoon. He'll wire you up. So I had no idea what that meant, but they put me out and you wired up. And you're talking like this all the time. So ventriloquist would be quite good. But you have it for about a month. And you can only take in fluid, Complan, etc. So I managed to lose 2.5 stone in weight, which was fantastic. But then it soon went back on again. So the day before, on the day we were going to Trowbridge, I played as an amateur all the time. I was at Dartford. I was an amateur, and the manager had said to me, "I want you to sign pro." And I thought, I don't really want to sign pro. I mean, I had this idea I might get a chance of playing for get an amateur cap, but the issue then, of course, was I didn't realise that if you played for a semi-professional side, there's still the amateur game, which didn't disappear till '74. You weren't going to get in, but I didn't realise that. Anyway, he's come to me and said, do you want to sign pro? I went, no. Anyway, I broke my jaw that day, so it didn't really affect anything. And then when I got back, I went on loan to Margate, who were in the Premier League at that stage. Dartford were in the division below. I had about 4 games there, and Ernie phoned me up and said, I don't think you're going to stay there because you're our player, blah, blah, blah. And I came back, and then I played against Ramsgate in March that year, and fella came and just whacked me. I was off the floor, and I tore both my cruciate ligaments and completely severed the medial, which meant the lower leg was just swinging away on its own. And that put me out for 9 months, but I just got back. Because those days you had no idea. There are only 2 treatments you ever got, was either ice or the heat lamp. Yeah. You've got more chance of getting second-degree burns off the heat lamp than it doing you any good. And you were left to your own devices. So I got myself an iron boot, and I just sort of rehabilitated myself. But what happened then was that meant I was never going to, even if I'd had a chance at that stage in my early 20s of having a career above non-league, it wasn't going to happen because I had issues with the knee all the way through. As a result, in recent years, I've had 2 new knees and 2 new hips. So that goes back to a fellow called Barry Simmons, who whacked me. I still remember his name, who put me out of the game. But about a few years later, the assistant manager said to me, "Oh, you know why Ernie tried to sign you?" And I said, "Well, no, I've got no idea." He said, "Oh, well, he'd had someone who made an offer for him. The league club had made an offer for you. And of course, you could have just gone because you're an amateur."
Yeah.
But he'd obviously told him, "Oh, he's under contract. He's such and such." And so by the time these injuries occurred, although I had a decent career after that in non-league, the sort of dreams of becoming a full-time pro were not really. It wasn't on. It wouldn't have been on because they haven't got the sort of treatments they get now. Dennis Rove told me a great story. The old Leicester footballer, when he was at Leyton Orient, he got an injury and he got told to go into the for treatment on the Sunday, and he went in and he went to the trainer's room, and they said, "No, can't go in there, can't go in there." And he sat outside for a while and eventually thought, "Well, what's going on?" So he looked around the corner, and there's the lamp, and they got a greyhound on the treatment table because obviously Leyton Orient, Hackney, the dogs. So they were trying to get this dog fit apparently for the racing. So that was his experience as a young player of being treated for injuries. I think it's slightly changed now when you see all these documentaries and all this sort of high-tech stuff. It wasn't quite that the same thing in those days.
Did you find out who the club was?
Sorry, did I find? That was Leyton Orient. It was Leyton Orient.
What, the club that wanted you?
Oh, no, well, I was told it was Blackpool.
Right.
When I'd first played, when I'd been at Chatham, when Ernie had me, there was Sheffield United had shown some sort of interest. But I mean, there's a lot of chat, but whether anybody really was interested, etc., or prepared to pay any money, I don't know. But anyway, so So then from then I was out for 9 months with the injury. Then got back and was then playing. And I had five years at Dartford. And the last year was when we won the Southern League Championship and got to the trophy final. Looking back, we got beat by Morton in the final, but we had few injuries, etc. And I realised that we played, leading up to the final, we played 8 games in 16 days. And basically, I think we were knackered. You know, we needed to be. It was during the sort of the power crisis. So in fact, you could only play on Saturdays, and therefore a lot of games we could, didn't play midweek at all. So at the end of the season, we had this great battle of games, etc.
Where was the final played? The trophy was it?
Oh, it was Wembley. I played at Wembley. Yeah.
Oh, was it Wembley?
Yeah. I know that it's funny because I think literally there are only 7 games were played that season at Wembley, because it really was special those days if you got to play at Wembley. And I've got a good mate, Mark Wallington, who played for Leicester City, goalkeeper at Leicester City, who I'm actually seeing next week sometime. And he had a great football league career, first division player in those days, proper division, not this Premier nonsense, first division, and he never played at Wembley. So lots of top, and in those days, players who played in the Football League never had the chance to play as I did. But we had, I mean, the fella who really made my career happen was Ernie Morgan, and he'd had his career finished at Gillingham when he was about 26. Became a manager, and he was a fantastic character, great singer. Would get up and sing all over the place on coaches and trains and what have you. But it was interesting because the season before we won the league, Doug Holden, the ex-Bolton, and up until about a couple of years ago, was the last remaining guy to have played in the Matthews Cup final in '53. He came as the manager. He made some signings, but he was a slight interesting character. And he stayed a season. We didn't do very well. We were in the bottom half. And then Ernie, who'd gone off to Maidstone and got them promoted, suddenly returned on the eve of the new season. And we weren't fancied at all. But of course, we just got into a run, as you sometimes did. And we had Graham Carr had come to us. He'd signed. Alan Carr's dad, who'd been at Northampton and was a terrific. I mean, when he played against you, you hated him because he really got stuck in, which in those days you could. And then he came when he played for us. He was terrific. He was a great character, lovely fella. And of course, Alan Carr tells the story about how he wasn't interested in football whatsoever. And of course, all the people in his local school thought he'd be a good player because his dad was the manager of the local side, Northampton, which didn't quite work out.
So I mean, when that sort of final was over, the FA Trophy, did you know that was going to be sort of your last game last season?
No. Oh no. What happened was that I knew that certain players got a certain little kickback, as it were, or to sign new contracts following season. I've been an amateur all the way through, so I could have held them to ransom, but obviously I didn't because I just liked playing football. That's all I wanted to do. So in '74 they got rid of the amateur and semi-pro basically. So you all became players. So I was just about to move into a house in Harrow, and I thought, well, let's see if I can get a few quid for myself because Ernie had been keen for me to sign pro before. So I went and saw him, and as all these things happen, they spent money on giving the manager a new car and all sorts of bits and pieces because we'd won the league. And he basically said to me, "Oh, we haven't got any money." So I thought, "Oh, well, that's useful." So anyway, I happened to be on a boat trip up on the Thames with someone, with my friend of my wife's who she taught with, and we got talking to this what happened to be her father, who was a Wealdstone supporter. And I was saying, well, I'm seriously thinking I'll leave Dartford because it's the aggravation of going backwards and forwards every Tuesday or Thursdays, training or playing. So I might look for another club. And the next thing is I get a phone call from Eddie Preslant, who was then the manager at Wealdstone, the ex-West Ham player. an Essex cricketer, and said, "I understand that you might be available." Well, I was completely available because I was I was an amateur. So Wealdstone was literally 10 minutes away from where I lived, where I bought the house. So they made me an offer, offered me a few quid, and I went, fine. Years later, some of the what was interesting was that, I'm not sure it's down to me completely, but Dartford had the record of being the only side to be champions one season, then relegated the next, because that's what happened to them. They went down and it was all based upon a number of players left, and it was about money. They brought people in, they brought so-called better players in who the lads knew were getting paid more money. And the bottom line was it just all fell to pieces. So I ended up going to Wealdstone, where I had 3 very enjoyable seasons. But then I was starting to get promoted in terms of the job, in my teaching job. And I was getting towards 30, and I had to start thinking about, well, do I want to carry on playing at this level, or do I want to drop slightly but keep playing, but obviously spend a bit more time getting qualified. So late 70s, I was about 30, 31. I was an acting deputy in a comprehensive school at that stage. It was basically, you stepped into dead men's and women's shoes, basically, if you could stick it out in. I was working in Paddington. So I went there, and I then went and started doing some extra courses to improve my qualifications. And I came across, I did an advanced diploma in an education, phys ed, and came across a fellow called Joe Jagger, who had a quite well-known son called Mick. And I had a couple of years with him, but he was terrific, because all the sort of information about training and diet and everything else had been out in America for some time, and he was a lecturer at Aveley College down in South London, and of course we sat and went through this, and at the time, training was pretty rudimentary. It was about running, make people sick, do a few sprints, and that was the name of the game. It was, you'd come back for pre-season, and most guys were not in great shape then, because they didn't have sort of programs to work to. And the first thing they'd do, they'd go on a run on the road, 6-mile run. So they came back totally knackered, knees no good, everything, aching, etc. And there was no sort of build up to the season, etc. So I spent the next sort of, 10, 15 years being involved in coaching and talking to people. And it was very much in the programme, you bang your head against the brick wall. And it probably wasn't until Wenger came. And I remember I was involved with the London coaches, and Wenger turned up with Bob Wilson, because Bob Wilson was the chairman. And it was the first thing he'd ever done in England when he arrived. And he talked about football and his ideas, etc. And it was like, in a sense, it was like a breath of fresh air, because I had actually been on coaching courses with ex-pros and various people. And because I was a teacher, you got plenty of flack and stick there, because you were seen as a clever sod or whatever, even if you weren't. And it was very difficult to change the culture of how you should work and train. But now we've gone to the other extreme now, because we've now got paralysis by analysis, because now we've got lots of people talking absolute rubbish about the game. Basically the fundamentals, principles of play don't change at all. They're very much the same. But I listen to the various people talking, and I'm not too impressed, actually. It's not the way it is when you're out there. One of the things when I'm coaching courses, I've got my full license after I'd finished playing, etc. I got my full coaching license. And one of the things that was stressed at that point was it's not chess. You can't just sort of move people around. If you watch on TV now, they suddenly stop it, freeze it, and they start saying, "Oh, he should be there." So that's not the way. When you're out there playing, you're aware of stuff around you, unless you're De Bruyne. And I think De Bruyne should have a 20-pound pack on his back, because it's not fair, the fact that what he sees and the quality of his play. it just isn't the way. And I'm listening to these guys talking and their analysis, etc. And I just reminded Bill Shankly made a comment. He said, "Football is a simple game made difficult by people who should know better." And I quote that all the time, because you know, how many teams can actually manage to pass the ball? You know, Man City can, but lots of teams at the levels who I see people coaching at, and particularly with young players, they talk about systems and what have you. But I say, well, what colours do you play? You know, see if you can pass to, if you're red, pass to a red shirt. Quite simple. This game's about pass and control, and where you take your positions up, etc. From that, how you support. But anyway,
So
I've got yeah. Go on.
Oh, mate, no, go on.
Well, I was just saying, you see, because I got very much into coaching, and I've got a great array of coaching. Going back to someone called Norman Creek, who Winterbottom Creek, and these people, and these lovely books about how you strike and kick a ball and whatever. But then I got one in the 60s. I mean, everyone goes on about, you know, Man City as they are now. You can go back to the 70s, the great Dutch sides. Rinus Michels, who was the manager there, he said, if you want to play the game, what they moved play from a sweeper system, whereby they then played one against one at the back and moved the sweeper up front to actually put pressure on the ball. So they actually won the ball in the final, in the sort of the final third, the opposition's final third, which of course is what it's all about now. They talk. Now that was back in that 70s. You go a bit before that into the 60s, and you'll see various people who sort of coached the game, etc. And they had systems then. You know, 1-4-4-1 on all this nonsense. It was there then. You know, so nothing in the world is new, and yet people start pretending and listening. I did an analysis. I'll be in trouble here probably. On the women's final European, and I've coached women. I've coached in the States. I've coached women in the States. I coached a Watford team when the quarterfinal of the Women's FA Cup were the only team to score a goal against Arsenal that year. So I watched the game, and I listened to what people said and change this, change that. I mean, did you realise that when England scored their goal, that was the first time in about 17 minutes they'd actually got into the German half, the German final third. And if you watch the game, the ball's given away a fantastic amount of the time. And I quite admired the coach, because what she did was she took the Williamson, who was a midfield player, and did exactly what all the Dutch do, have done for years and years, going back into the 70s, where you pick a good midfield player, pass him, and you play him in the back. So you've got a player who can come out from the back of the ball comfortably and pass the ball.
Because that's where she plays for Arsenal, of course, being at the centre half. She's been a centre half all the time, and they just kept using her in midfield, didn't they, for England all the time? Yeah.
Well, no, they moved her back though, didn't they? It was the other way around. She'd actually played a defensive midfield player for the Arsenal, apparently, and then they put her back in that. But I mean, I did that with the district side, which we won England Schools Trophy. I did exactly that, and the kid ended up getting an England cap. He didn't have a career after that, you'd expect, but he, you know, I wanted someone who could play like that. And I'd read this stuff, you know, how the Dutch did it, and I thought that's a good idea. You know, keep the ball if you can. But that was part of the teaching thing. I was lucky because when I'd finished playing, I then went and got involved with England Schools, and I ended up as the chair of England Schools. But I did a lot of work on coaching side with an organisation called AFCAT, which had been Association of Football Coaches and Teachers, which was organised through Adidas. And I went to South Africa doing some coaching and did quite a few things. That was quite good. So once I'd finished playing, I had 3 seasons at Wealdstone, went to Hounslow for a few seasons, and then ended up playing at Hamwell, who are now in one of the Southern League. I think they're in one of the Southern League sides now, aren't they?
Yeah, they are,
yeah. So I went there with a fellow called Joey Gadsden, and that was enjoyable.
Probably one of the best grass pitches is in non-league as well.
It's a fantastic surface, yeah.
Fantastic place.
And I've got, well, my later career, I told you before, David, I ended up working for the Premier League. It's quite an interesting story about that. But one of the guys there, Ross Christie, who's I think he still is at Premier League. He was a player. He played, good little player. Played in the Northeast and then came and played at Edgware, etc., where my son was playing at the time. And he's the finance man, but he was also on the what do you call it? The where the grounds committees, etc., where they give grants out to all the bits and pieces. So he was very much fundamental because his own background in playing non-league. Mm-hmm. He was very keen to actually get the money to the clubs like, you know, Hamwell and various other people, so they could improve their facilities. But Hamwell's fabulous. Yeah, it's a lovely playing surface, isn't it?
So how did you go from sort of, you know, head of schools, you know, and how do we get from there to sort of being involved in the Premier League?
Well, it's like one of those things. I ended up in education as a director of an upper school of 1,000 kids in Paddington, and it's now the Paddington Basin. So it's funny because the Premier League offices are now where I used to take assemblies in that area. So, cut a long story short, I managed to escape teaching when I was sort of in my 50s. And all I was going to do was do a bit of coaching, etc., because I'd done work for the London FA and the Middlesex FA. So I was looking, you know, I got out on early retirement, and then I went up the road to get the paper. I used to get the Telegraph, but didn't have one because of the sport on a Sunday, and I picked up Sunday Times, and in there was an article saying that with the advent of professional referees in England, they were looking to the clubs said, well, as we're paying for it, we'd like to have some input. So they were looking to, you know, have ex-players, coaches, managers having some say, going watching games and representing the Premier League, and then coming back and telling the clubs, reporting back to the clubs saying, well, you know, they're doing a decent job, or, you know, how can we improve it, or anything. So this was just an article. So my late wife then said to me, well, why don't you could do that? And as usual, like most blokes, you say, oh, well, you know, yeah, tomorrow, I'll write tomorrow. She says, no, come on, we'll sit down and write. So I dropped a line to a fellow called Phil Don, who was then in charge of to Phil Don, who was in charge of refereeing that stage. And the next thing is, we'd been away for a week's holiday because unfortunately my wife was suffering from cancer. And when we came back, there was a couple of messages on my phone. And it was Mike Foster, who was then the secretary of the Premier League, and said, I've just been given this letter and we'd like to come have a chat, you know. I basically said, well, I quite the idea of being a delegate. Well, when I turned up to see him, and there's a lovely girl on reception called Laura Faulkner, who is now Big Noise at Brentford, done very well for. I always remember this because I always remember about the importance of how you greet people, etc. And I always said when I was teaching to youngsters, one of the most important things is that you only get one chance to make a first impression. And the impression she made on me was someone who was really interested, knew who I was, and all the rest of it. And I've mentioned this to her years gone by. But anyway, I went to see Mike, and he said to me, well, you know, ideally, I'd met him before through the England schools because of issues, because he was then been in the Football League before he went to the Premier League. And he said, I think you'd be okay for a delegate, but I need someone to run it. So I then said, well, what does it entail? And he said, well, you're going to get a number of people who are going to go out to games, and we want to get some idea of how well the referees are doing. So we had three aspects to look at, which was major decisions, consistency, and management of players. Now, if anyone thinks they're not very too clever today, I suggest you watch the Big Match Revisited if you want to see refereeing back in the 70s, because you won't believe it in a sense, but that's by the by. So anyway, so he said, well, you know, this was sort of March time in 2003, and he said to me, you know, are you interested in the job? I said, well, yeah, you know, I thought about 10 seconds, less than 10 seconds probably. I said, well, yeah, you know, sounds interesting. So I then went to meet a fellow called Mick Maguire, who was then at the PFA. We all came back from this meeting, and Mike just said to me, well, look, you know, you obviously get on well with most of the people, you know people. Do you fancy doing this? So I said, well, yeah. He said, well, I'll speak to who was then the in charge, Richard Scudamore, and see what he thinks. And next thing, I get a phone call and he says, right, you know, the job's yours if you want it. I mean, one of the key things about the job, the money was terrible. So everyone thinks you get paid vast amount. It was terrible, and it was part time, about 3 days a week. That soon became 4, but never changed. But it's that suited me, and I then got together a group of guys. They were basically nominated by the PFA, Professional Football Association, and the League Managers Association. And there were a couple of guys who've been secretaries of clubs, like David Dent, who'd been in charge secretary of the Football League, for example. He came. And Mike said to me, well, do you want to interview everybody or what? And I said, no, let's take everybody, because we don't want to have a situation where we have more with one group than the other and people start from the word go, they're going to get the hump. So anyway, I then put together a package of how they would report back to me, and then we would then pass that information into the clubs themselves, the club secretaries. So I did in the end. I worked it was more or less full time, really, because I was looking at 10 games a week. I get the DVDs and VHS in those days initially. And I would then just look at every single game and look at the issues and look at the reports that have been written to me and say, right, well, you know, and then sometimes go back if I thought they got something wrong in law. And the first meeting I ever had was at Staverton, and someone you've already spoken with was Keith Hackett, because then Phil Don went and Keith then took on. I got on really well with Keith, and you know, he's a bit of a character. And we got together, and I was invited up to Staverton, where the referees were, where they come together every fortnight and where they would train. And I remember sitting with a fellow called Matt Weston, because they brought in a fitness specialist, and he's now, I think he's doctor now, Matt, smashing fella, good lad. And I'm watching these fellas run across the field and back, and I said to him, they don't look too clever, do they? And he said, well, they're sort of in their 40s and, you know, different ages and sizes and what have you. And then we had a meeting in a lecture room, and I've gone in, and it was just like when you go in, if you're a supply teacher, you go into school and you've got all these naughty kids there. I've got, you know, the Graham Poles, the Steve Bennetts, all these people, Mark Halsey. I think you've spoken to Mark as well. And it was hilarious, because I stood there, and they're looking at me thinking, who's this clown? What's he come for? You know, what's his background? I'd actually qualified as a referee, class 3, when I was at college, but I'd only refereed sort of a few bits of Sunday football, but a load of schools football I'd done. So, but I knew the laws of the game. That was the whole issue, and I made sure that I did know the laws of the game. So I then explained to them exactly what we intended to do and how the system would work, and you could see that very, you know, skeptical, and, you know, what can they tell us? You know, they're players and ex-players, etc. But it was interesting, because the younger ones in the group, they really took it on board, and people like Kenny Hibbert, who was one of the delegates, who was a fantastic fella, he was brilliant. He was fantastic with them, and they suddenly got a much more of an idea of how players felt, and the things that annoyed you as a player, and the refereeing. And if you see nowadays, whatever anybody says about the refereeing, is much more calmer, I would say. You don't see referees running about throwing, you know, arms about, and they'll still make mistakes. They'll still get things wrong. But the amount of time they spend now in terms of their fitness, in terms of looking at the decisions they've made, rightly or wrongly. So that started out, and it became quite a strength. And after a while, it became that they had a merit table, which 50% of the marks was from the referee assessor, who would come, who'd be an ex-referee, who'd do it, and 50% would be from my guys. And their sort of bonus payments at the end of the season would then depend upon that.
Well, can I ask you one question? Because it's interesting that you brought that up, you know, and I've brought this sort of conversation up with the likes of Keith and Mark as well, and I'd be interested to get your take on it as well. when you see, I mean, one of the biggest gripes, especially in non-league football, is the fact that as soon as an assessor turns up for a referee, you're in for a hard night. So my question would be is why is it that referees, and I was a referee myself as well, why is it with referees that is maybe at that level and above and a little bit below, they referee with what some people might say common sense, say on this Saturday, but then they know that somebody like yourself's going to turn up the following Saturday, and all of a sudden these yellow cards going in and out of everywhere, and they're not refereeing it with the common sense that they refed it with the week before. Is that pressure? Do you think that they know the assessors there? Would it be better without them knowing?
Well, there's always going to be some pressure. I mean, I don't believe that. See, I think you're either a good referee or not a good referee, and you can be out there. I mean, I've seen people. I go out and watch sometimes on. I've watched in the past when my son was playing Sunday football, and then when he was playing in the higher leagues, etc. And I used to go and watch people who've been refereeing for 10, 15 years, and they weren't very good. They weren't, when they started, and they didn't improve, whatever. So there is this idea that if an assessor comes, and depends who it is. When we first started doing this job, when I first met, I went to meetings and met some of the guys who I'd had as a referee when I was a bit younger, when they'd been coming up through the system, through the Southern League system and elsewhere. And I'd listen to them, and I think to myself, well, I'm not sure that what you're telling younger referees is really, because what was happening was they would go to a game and want to see the referee the way they refereed, whereas my group of guys would go with no background in refereeing, would just go and watch the game. Now they might have a view about someone depending upon their attitudes. I remember I did Mark Clattenburg's first game in the Premier League at Crystal Palace, and he started telling me what he expected of me, and I then had to tell him what actually, I'll tell you what I think of your performance. You can take it or leave it, basically. But I think there is, once you get in the promotion stakes, because as you know, when you first start as a referee, you can referee at that level for as long as you like. But if you want to move up, then you have to have someone coming to look at you and assess you, etc. And therefore, I think there's a certain amount of, well, he's different. I don't accept this. Oh, you use common sense one week and not the next. I think people, they referee their personalities. So, I get very annoyed. It annoys me when these players talk about, oh yeah, of course, so and so. They'll have a chat and whatever. And you used to chat to referee. That's rubbish. Anyone who had Darryl Reeves from Uxbridge, he wouldn't talk to anybody. It was interesting because when I played in the Athenian League, I played at Ruislip Manor at one stage for a couple of seasons before I went to Hanwell, and they were an Athenian League. And in those days, you'd have people like Colin Downey, Darryl Reeves, John Homewood, who were all Football League referees in the First Division. If they weren't refereeing, they'd come and referee in one of these, the Athenian, because Athenian was seen as one of the sort of good amateur leagues. So you'd have them on the following Saturday. So you might have seen them in Match of the Day against Man United Ipswich. And they're down at Grosvenor Vale, refereeing Ruislip Manor. And Phil Donald refereed me there. And I can remember there were a few of them. Colin was one of those you could have a chat to. But majority you didn't have a chat to. So I don't believe in this nonsense where they go, oh yeah, well he's all right, so and so. And you watch, as I say, watch the big match revisited and see the way referees behave towards players. It's appalling. It's just the players accept it because that's what it was in those days. I mean, again, you could whack someone before them doing anything, but their positioning and their general, sort of wagging a finger and telling people to come toward, acting like I hate to say the sort of head teacher there, were appalling. I think the issue you've got now is trying to get there's whatever anybody says, COVID created a lot of people dropped off and don't want to go back to refereeing. And I've tried to do some work for Middlesex to help mechanic, because I was going out watching games on Sundays and seeing young referees try to referee with adults who know nothing about the game, shouting nonsense around the touchline, encouraging the kids. And I'd actually said to them, well, I'm quite happy to go out have a word with the experience. I mean, I'd done over 3,000. I think I'd done 300 odd games in the Premier League as an assessor myself, and then sort of looked at something in excess of 3,000 games in terms of how people refereed. So I think I picked up a little bit of knowledge. But in all these things, you see, you volunteer, and they're very enthusiastic, and then you don't do anymore. So I now just go and watch games. But I think the issue they've got is bringing young referees through maybe a bit too quickly on occasions. But I do dispute the view that refereeing it was much better years and years ago. It wasn't. The difference is that we now have 27 cameras at a Premier League game, which you show from every angle under the sun, and it's not straightforward. I've had a go at the VAR, by the way, because we got invited to go across to Stockley Park to have a go at it. And I was quite impressed because I sat there with the screens and all the rest of it. And there was one particular decision. And I think I got to my final decision in about 7.5 minutes. So I think people would have probably gone home by the time we got to it. It is not as straightforward and simple as people seem to think. I'd much rather have someone sitting in the armchair in your own home without any pressure at all and going, bang, he's got that right.
Do you not think, and this is my personal opinion here, I don't think the problem's the VAR. I think the problem's the rules. Because the laws, all that VAR's doing is just enforcing the rules, and so you see,
as soon as you use the word rules, referees go berserk because they know it's the laws.
Laws, yeah.
So as soon as a pundit uses the word rules, they just ignore them. So even if they've got something sensible to say, because they're not bothered to find out that you have laws in cricket, you have laws in football. They're not rules. And because they're brought up on this idea, handball's a classic example. You see, I mean, I had discussions, and we would have regular debates. So we would have meetings with the referees, etc., certain times during the year, and look at instances and issues. And one of the things that I found, this use of the word, not a natural position for the arm, right? So that's the handball. There was one given on the weekend, wasn't it? Aston Villa, I think. God, there's no way in the world that in our day, we understood what handball was. It was a deliberate motion to actually knock the ball away from someone, stop it going in the goal, or whatever. It wasn't a big deal. But as soon as you start to complicate it and start talking about distances and talking about unusual positions and what have you, I remember I was playing at a time when referees didn't understand, because they'd not played, about players who went over the top of the ball. Now, people, you go back into the 70s, you'll see some horrendous challenges of people, and referees just letting it go because they didn't, and it wasn't until I would say that was one of the things that we used to talk to the referees about, was about the sort of challenges. I went to a National League game on last Saturday, Wealdstone and Halifax, and the young referee there, Paul Durkin, was his dad, who was a famous, well-known referee, international referee as well. Now, James, I think his name is, he's coming up through the system, but he gave a few free kicks, which I found annoying, because players who deliberately shield the ball and then get a touch and then fall over and go down. In the league this season, more people, they've let it go a little bit, but then the crowds expect it. And if you're playing in international football, or you're playing abroad, then they expect the free kicks. They don't expect to play advantages. They want free kicks. So it was a classic one game where Mark Halsey was refereeing an Arsenal playing someone at Wembley, might be in Barcelona or something like that. It was in a pre-season tournament, and he wanted to play. He used to joke about Mark, because you say, well, the only time you blow the whistle is when you start the game, and when you blow it for half time, and then start the second half and blow full time, because he would always be playing advantage, or trying to play advantage. But the foreign side just didn't want it, and he's trying, and they just stopped. They wouldn't play. So he's trying to wait for, and eventually he was having to blow the whistle to give them the free kick, because it was, but they could get an advantage. The issue that our referees have got, international referees, is because UEFA and FIFA will be draconian in terms of what they expect. And if they don't referee to the way they are being told, they're out. They won't get a chance to move on internationally. So you come back, they then come back from international week and come back to referee in the Premier League, and they're now being expected to let it go, let things go. Anyone raises your boot. There was a discussion the other day on a podcast. I think it was Wilson and that was the fellow from West Ham, Antonio, isn't it?
Yeah.
Plays up front. And he tried to knock a ball over someone's head in the game, and his foot was right up, and the fellas flinched away. And they're going, oh, well, you should let it go, and should, we'd have probably, VAR would have said it was all right, so-and-so. If you did that in a Barcelona-Madrid game, they wouldn't even query it. The supporters wouldn't query it. I'd actually went to one. Was involved with the sort of European leagues at one point for a short period of time, and they would say to us, "Why do you have this problem with offside? Why do the British have a problem with offside? Because we are totally different to the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't have issues on certain things, and yet we do. But because we're so insular, and because we actually think, we invented the game, therefore we're the ones who decide, blah blah blah." On the IFAB panel, there are 8 places, and 4 of them are taken by the home countries, and the other 4 is by the rest of the world. No wonder they don't like us. So unless you get a 6th vote, you see,
But I mean, time's running away from us a little bit. But yes. I mean, literally with the actual sort of from that position, in the Premier League. I mean, what's John Morton up to these days?
Well, he started doing some writing about things because he always had, as you probably realise, he's fairly opinionated. So I started to. I've written a few things. In the past, I'd done a few sort of chats and talks to people, but at the moment, I'm doing very little. I go and watch. I go to Wealdstone games, etc., and I go to other non-league games. And my son was still playing then. I go to Edgware and Welling Gardens City, I think he played at. He played at Wealdstone, Northwood, and all these sorts of teams. So I'll still go and watch. I go out on Sundays and still watch. But apart from that, I'm thinking about maybe going back to my roots in the Garden of England in Kent. I'm not sure yet, but no, I finished. I worked for the Premier League from 2003 till 2019, just before the pandemic, and I then I got retired at that stage. I thought that's fair enough because I'd had a good run, and I've always believed that once you step away from something, I hate the idea of people coming back and whinging on and going about, "I was much better in my day," blah blah blah. Whether that be involved with England schools or playing or with the Premier League, because often when I went, people then say, "Oh, it's not the same as when you were there," and very nice. The great thing about being an ex-player, of course, and particularly a Southern League player, is that the further you get away from your playing career, the better you become. You've never had a bad game, it turns out. I mean, people come and chat to you, and they remember this, that, and the other. But
I think that's. Do you know what, John? I think that's a great way to finish. I think that's brilliant. The longer you go, hopefully that goes on. But John, listen, a massive thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it today, joining us and giving up your time to join us on the show. And me and hopefully Steve will be back with another episode of My Life in Football very, very soon. But from me and John for tonight, thank you very much for watching, and good night.